This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report, coming to you with the inaugural edition of a brand new feature interview podcast series that's coming in both audio and video form from the Center for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. And appropriately enough, for the very first edition of this interview series, we're talking to none other than the director of the Center for Research on Globalization, Professor Michel Chossudovsky, who's joining us today from Montreal, Canada. Professor Chossudovsky, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and welcome to the program.
Absolutely delighted. Best wishes in Japan.
Well, thank you very much. Well, it's a delight to have you here and to draw on your years and years of experience covering a wide range of topics, obviously, at the at globalresearch.ca. But today I actually wanted to start by talking about something that's on the minds of many of my listeners and viewers and people out there right now as we approach the 10th anniversary of the tragic events of September 11th and all of the incredible things that have come from those events, those world-changing events, and that's something that I know has quite an intimate history with globalresearch.ca. As I understand it, Global Research was actually launched just 2 days before September 11th, and it almost immediately became a locus for independent and alternative reporting about the developing official narrative of that time. So perhaps you can take us back to the September 2001 and setting up this website and how things developed from there.
Well, it was a very important landmark in my life, certainly. On the 9th of September, following a crash course in FTP transfers with a young man who actually was physically handicapped, and he came on a wheelchair to my home, and he said, well, do it this way, and we got it going. And so on the 9th of September, essentially operating with front page and very rudimentary software, we launched the website. I manned it from my home. It was I updated it. I had a student actually in philosophy was helping me with the postings, and this was on the 9th of September 2001. And then I recall vividly on the morning of September 11, I was driving to the office at the University of Ottawa, and I listened to the announcements on the radio. And when I got to the university, a little bit before 11 o'clock, the Bush administration had already declared, without any evidence, that Al-Qaeda, with the support of the Taliban government of Afghanistan, were behind the 9/11 attacks. And this statement was actually made by George Tenet, the head of the CIA at the moment, at that particular time. And then in the evening at 9:30 p.m., they convened a war cabinet. They convened a war cabinet which was integrated by a select number of top intelligence and military advisors, and then they launched the war on Afghanistan, essentially. They launched the war on terrorism, and the following day, as some people might recall, NATO actually corroborated under the articles of the Washington Washington Treaty, which is the main document of NATO. They said that Afghanistan had attacked the United States. That's essentially what it meant, and the U.S. media in chorus was calling for a military intervention against Afghanistan without a shred of evidence as to the involvement of a foreign country in these attacks. And then barely 4 weeks later, on the 7th of October, Afghanistan was bombed and invaded by U.S. troops. And we were led to believe that the decision to go to war had been taken on the spur of the moment on the evening of 9/11 by the war cabinet in response to the attacks by a foreign country which was supporting Al-Qaeda, and that was in fact the initiation of this war on terrorism, and it was also the initiation of the big lie, because Afghanistan had nothing to do with these 9/11 attacks. There was absolutely no evidence, and in fact, there was no evidence even that Al-Qaeda was behind the 9/11 attacks, and in fact, confirmed subsequently, Osama bin Laden had been hospitalized on the 9th of September in a military hospital in Rawalpindi. And anybody who knows Rawalpindi knows that it's swarming with US military advisors, so that if he had been treated for his kidney problems on the 9th of September, released one day later, it's not entirely clear when he was released, he could not have organized these 9/11 attacks from his hospital bed in the city of Rawalpindi, which is essentially the headquarters of the Pakistani military, Pakistani intelligence, and a country which has very close military and intelligence ties with the United States of America. But what disturbed me most, I think, in those events of 9/11 is that several things. One, the public was not informed by the media that a large-scale theater operation against Afghanistan cannot be planned on the spur of the moment and executed in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, okay, which was ultimately the case. The War Cabinet declares war on Afghanistan in the evening of 9/11, and then 4 weeks later, on the 7th of October, Afghanistan is bombed and invaded. And anybody who has the minimal understanding of military planning will know that that type of operation takes months and months and sometimes years of preparation. But at least several months of preparation would have been required to wage that type of large-scale military operation against Afghanistan, which suggests that the planning of the war in Afghanistan predated 9/11, and that 9/11 in effect was the pretext and the justification to wage a war which was already on the drawing board of the Pentagon, which was in the pipeline, which was in an advanced state of readiness. And that is very important. Whatever one's view on 9/11, 9/11 provided the pretext and the justification for waging a war on humanitarian grounds with the full support of world public opinion. And I should mention also the endorsement of progressive intellectuals, progressive left-wing intellectuals who made the case for a retaliation against terrorism on moral and ethical grounds, the just cause. I recall in Canada how progressive organizations, trade unions, NGOs, everybody was supportive of the just cause military doctrine, namely to accept and uphold at face value the response of the US military and its NATO allies directed against an impoverished country in Central Asia, namely Afghanistan. That, of course, was the purpose of 9/11. Ultimately, it was also to launch the war on terrorism. It was to launch the Patriot legislation. It was to launch the national security agenda, the police state. And I think essentially what we have to do is to go back in history and examine the extent to which this event has changed the course of history and has modified in a very fundamental way U.S. military doctrine.
Well, there's no doubt that it certainly has done that, and it has shaped so much of the past 10 years. But from today's perspective, it's, I think, difficult to put ourselves back in the context of 2001 and to really understand what it was to have lived through that with the understanding that we have now of those events. And I think you've gestured towards that, talking about the way that the just cause was taken up by so many different people from the left and the right of the political spectrum, and was parroted in those early days. But certainly you yourself were skeptical right from the very start, and you penned the article "Who is Osama bin Laden?" the very next day on September 12th of 2001. Who else was involved in those early days, questioning the developing official narrative?
Well, there were quite a number of people at the time who questioned it, but I think eventually we got to know one another from very different perspectives. People in the intelligence community, people who were interested and concerned with geopolitics, so that eventually the 9/11 truth movement became much more pervasive. But right at the beginning, I think that people were producing their own response to these events based on the research that they had done. And of course, there was a citizens movement which was questioning the rationale of the U.S. Sponsored war in Afghanistan. But I think things got going rather slowly, and eventually a lot of people, even in the progressive movements, who had supported, had supported the official narrative, started to gradually change their perspective. And of course, 10 years down the road, 9/11 truth has progressed tremendously, and a large sector of the US population and world public opinion actually is supportive of 9/11 truth, and certainly questions the 9/11 official narrative. But I recall, I wrote this article on the 12th of September. In fact, I had been investigating issues pertaining to Al-Qaeda, covert operations, the drug trade, going back several years, and particularly focusing on the Balkans, on Yugoslavia, where Al-Qaeda was used as an intelligence asset, both in Bosnia as well as in Kosovo, where Mujahideen integrated the Muslim Bosnian army at the time, and then subsequently also collaborated with the KLA. And I understood fair well that bin Laden was a creation of the CIA. Al-Qaeda was a US intelligence asset, and that what struck me at first was to say, well, if Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are those responsible for the 9/11 attacks, then my answer would be, who is behind bin Laden and Al-Qaeda? And going back to the Soviet-Afghan war, I knew fair well the history, the fact that the Islamic Jihad was a creation of US foreign policy. It was part of a CIA initiative. I also knew that Pakistan's military intelligence, the ISI, was heavily involved in supporting Al-Qaeda on behalf of the CIA, and of course, so that in the first hours of 9/11, I became extremely skeptical, reading the press reports, and then I got home. I got home in the evening of 9/11 after having given my courses, in fact, the irony is on that same day I was granted the Professor of the Year award by my faculty at the University of Ottawa, and I then discussed with my students what was happening.